Amara grew up surrounded by stories of love. Her parents, high school sweethearts, still held hands as they walked through the park in their 50s. Her grandmother spoke of her late husband with a wistful smile, recounting how he had courted her with handwritten letters and wildflowers plucked from the fields near their village. Love in Amara's home wasn't just an ideal. It was a legacy, woven into the fabric of who she was. She carried that legacy with her as she stepped into adulthood, bright-eyed and hopeful, her heart open to the idea of finding someone who would see her the way her father saw her mother, someone who would treasure her laughter, her quirks, and the way her curls refused to be tamed no matter how much product she used. When Amara met Daniel during her sophomore year of college, it felt like fate. They were both working late at the campus library. She was poring over notes for her sociology exam, while he was sketching architectural designs in his notebook. Their first conversation began with a simple question. "Do you have a pen I could borrow?" Amara, without looking up, handed him the pen from her bag. When she finally glanced at him, she had to do a double take. He was tall and lean, with soft brown eyes that crinkled when he smiled. His sandy blonde hair looked like it belonged in a shampoo commercial, and his voice held a warmth that made her feel immediately at ease. "Thanks," he said, holding up the pen with a grin. "I swear I'll give it back." "You better," she quipped, unable to stop the smile tugging at her lips. That was the beginning. What followed was a friendship that quickly blossomed into something more. They spent hours talking about everything, from their childhood dreams to their favorite movies. He told her about his plans to design sustainable buildings that would transform urban landscapes, and she shared her passion for community advocacy and social justice. Daniel seemed different from anyone she had ever met. He wasn't just charming. He was attentive, kind, and genuinely interested in her thoughts and opinions. He asked questions that made her feel seen, like he truly wanted to understand who she was beneath the surface. Their first date was at a small Ethiopian restaurant near campus. Daniel had never tried the cuisine before, but he was eager to learn. Amara watched as he struggled to eat injera without a fork, laughing as he tried to pronounce the names of the dishes. By the end of the night, he had insisted on walking her back to her dorm, holding her hand as they strolled under the glow of the campus streetlights. "I like you," he had said, his voice soft but steady. Amara's heart had fluttered at his words. "I like you too." From that moment on, they were inseparable. They spent weekends exploring art galleries, hiking trails, and trying out new recipes in her tiny apartment kitchen. Daniel introduced her to his world of privilege, a world of country clubs, ski trips, and summer homes, and she introduced him to hers, a vibrant community filled with laughter, loud family gatherings, and the rich smells of home-cooked meals. At first, it seemed like they were building a bridge between two different worlds. Daniel embraced her culture with enthusiasm, learning to cook jollof rice with her mother and dancing at family weddings. Amara, in turn, tried to fit into his world, even when it felt foreign and uncomfortable. She swapped her bright Ankara prints for muted tones when they attended his family's events, and she laughed off the subtle comments about her unique appearance. But for all the differences between them, their love felt like a safe harbor. Daniel made her feel cherished in a way she had never experienced before. He would leave sticky notes with sweet messages on her laptop, surprise her with her favorite flowers, and hold her hand tightly whenever they walked through the crowded city streets. "I don't care about what anyone thinks," he had told her once, after one of his friends made a tactless joke about their relationship. "I love you, Amara. That's all that matters." And she believed him. For 2 years, their love felt unshakable. They talked about the future, about the life they wanted to build together. Amara pictured a little house with a garden, filled with light and laughter. She imagined Daniel by her side, their dreams intertwined like the roots of an old oak tree. But life has a way of unraveling even the most beautiful dreams. The first cracks in their relationship were so small, so imperceptible, that Amara barely noticed them at first. Daniel had always been attentive, always looking for ways to make her smile. But as their third year of college began, something shifted. It started with the little things. He stopped texting her goodnight like he used to. Their late-night phone calls, once filled with laughter and shared dreams, became shorter, more routine. He seemed distracted, his mind elsewhere even when they were together. "Are you okay?" she asked one evening as they sat on her couch, a half-eaten pizza box between them. "Yeah," he said, forcing a smile. "Just a lot on my plate right now. Classes, internships. You know how it is." Amara nodded, wanting to believe him. She told herself that the stress of school was getting to both of them, but in the back of her mind, a small voice whispered that something was wrong. The voice grew louder when Daniel began canceling plans. Their weekly coffee dates turned into hurried conversations in passing. He started spending more time with his architecture classmates, claiming he needed to focus on a group project. One evening, she decided to surprise him. She showed up at the student lounge where he often studied, carrying his favorite latte and a bag of homemade cookies. But when she arrived, she found him sitting with a group of friends laughing and chatting like he didn't have a care in the world. Amara hesitated in the doorway, unsure whether to join them. She watched as a tall blonde girl leaned over to look at something on Daniel's laptop, her hand brushing his arm. He didn't pull away. "Amara," Daniel's voice broke through her thoughts. He looked up and waved her over, his smile bright but tinged with surprise. She walked over, forcing herself to smile. The blonde girl glanced at her, her expression unreadable before turning back to her phone. "I didn't know you were coming," Daniel said, standing to greet her. "I thought I'd surprise you," Amara replied, holding up the latte and cookies. "Thanks," he said, taking them from her. But his hug felt perfunctory, his attention already drifting back to the group. Amara stayed for a few minutes trying to join in the conversation, but she felt like an outsider. The blonde girl, Emily, as Daniel introduced her, barely acknowledged her presence. Amara couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't belong, that she was intruding on a world where she would never truly fit. That night, as she lay in bed, her mind replayed the scene over and over. She hated the way Daniel had looked at Emily, the easy camaraderie between them. But more than that, she hated the way it made her feel. Small, insecure, and unworthy. She didn't want to be the jealous girlfriend, didn't want to jump to conclusions. But her instincts told her something was off. A few weeks later, her worst fears were confirmed. It was a chilly afternoon in November, and Amara decided to stop by their favorite cafe for a cup of chai. The cafe held so many memories for her. First dates, study sessions, lazy Sunday mornings spent talking about everything and nothing. As she walked in, the familiar smell of coffee and pastries wrapped around her like a warm hug. But then she saw them. Daniel and Emily. They were sitting in the corner booth, the one she and Daniel used to claim as their own. Emily was leaning toward him, her laughter ringing out like a melody. Daniel's hand rested on the table, inches from hers. Time seemed to freeze. Amara's breath caught in her throat as she took in the scene. The intimacy between them was undeniable, a stark contrast to the growing distance she had felt with Daniel. For a moment, she thought about walking away, about sparing herself the humiliation, but the anger, bubbling inside her, refused to be silenced. She marched over to their table, her heart pounding in her chest. "Daniel," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and heartbreak. He looked up, his eyes widening in surprise. "Amara, hey, what are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same thing," she said, her gaze flickering to Emily. There was an awkward silence as Emily shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "This isn't what it looks like," Daniel began, standing up. "Isn't it?" Amara shot back, her voice rising. "Because it looks like you're on a date with her, in the same spot where we used to sit." Emily stood, mumbling something about giving them space, but Amara barely noticed. Her focus was on Daniel, on the man who had promised to love her but now stood before her with guilt written all over his face. "We need to talk," he said, his tone pleading. "Talk?" Amara let out a bitter laugh. "You should have thought about that before you decided to replace me." "It's not like that," he insisted, but the words rang hollow. Amara didn't stay to hear his excuses. She turned and walked out of the cafe, her vision blurred by tears. That night, Daniel came to her apartment begging her to listen. He claimed it wasn't about Emily, that their relationship had been falling apart for months. "We just grew apart," he said, his voice heavy with defeat. "It has nothing to do with who you are." But Amara knew better. She had seen the way his friends joked about their relationship, the way his mother never quite warmed up to her. She had ignored the subtle signs, the microaggressions, because she wanted to believe their love was strong enough to overcome anything. Now, standing in the wreckage of their relationship, she realized how naive she had been. The days after the breakup passed in a haze. Amara moved through them as though she were underwater, everything muffled and distorted, her body heavy with a grief she couldn't seem to shake. She had always thought heartbreak was something you cried out in a single night, a storm that would pass with the morning sun. But this wasn't a storm. It was a slow, suffocating silence that wrapped around her and refused to let go. She avoided the places they used to go together, skipping her usual cafe and taking different routes to class so she wouldn't accidentally run into him. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from friends asking if she was okay, but she couldn't bring herself to respond. What could she say? That the boy she thought was her forever had left her for someone who was everything she could never be? Her social media feeds became a minefield of pain, each scroll revealing another picture of Daniel and Emily. There they were at a party, Emily's arm draped casually around his shoulders. There they were on a weekend getaway, smiling at the camera like they didn't have a care in the world. Amara stared at those pictures, her chest tightening with a familiar ache. She tried to tell herself it wasn't about Emily, that it wasn't about the blonde hair, the blue eyes, the effortless way she seemed to fit into Daniel's world. But deep down, Amara knew it was. The whispers began soon after. She heard them in the hallways, in the classrooms, in the back corners of the library where people thought she couldn't hear. "I knew it wouldn't last," someone said, loud enough for her to catch. "She's pretty, but, not his type," another voice chimed in. Amara clenched her fists, holding back the tears that threatened to spill. She hated how her relationship had become gossip fodder, how strangers felt entitled to dissect her life as if it were a soap opera. Worse than the whispers were the microaggressions she had once ignored but now felt like daggers. She thought back to the time Daniel's friend had called her exotic at a party, his tone dripping with condescension, or how his cousin had run her fingers through Amara's curls without asking, laughing as she exclaimed, "It's so different." She had brushed it off at the time, not wanting to make a scene. But now, those moments replayed in her mind with painful clarity. They weren't harmless. They were reminders that she would always be seen as other, no matter how hard she tried to fit in. Even her closest friends didn't seem to understand the depth of her pain. "You'll find someone else," they said, their voices full of unhelpful optimism. It's his loss. But it didn't feel like his loss, it felt like hers. One night, unable to sleep, Amara sat in front of her bedroom mirror, staring at her reflection. Her dark brown skin glowed in the soft light of the lamp, her curls framing her face like a halo. She reached up to touch her cheek, her fingers trembling. Why wasn't this enough? The question echoed in her mind, relentless and cruel. She thought about how Daniel used to look at her, how he used to tell her she was beautiful. But now, all she could see was the image of him and Emily together. Emily, with her fair skin and straight hair, the kind of beauty that society celebrated and idolized. Amara's hand fell to her lap, her heart heavy with a truth she didn't want to admit. It wasn't just Daniel who had rejected her. It was the world he represented, a world that had never truly accepted her. She tried to distract herself with work, throwing herself into her studies and volunteering at the community center. But even there, the weight of her heartbreak followed her. One afternoon, as she helped a group of kids with their homework, a little girl with wide eyes and braids asked, "Miss Amara, why are you sad?" Amara froze, her throat tightening. She forced a smile and shook her head. "I'm not sad, sweetheart," she said, ruffling the girl's hair. But the girl's question lingered long after the session ended. Her lowest point came at a mutual friend's birthday party. Amara had debated whether or not to go, knowing there was a chance Daniel and Emily would be there, but she didn't want to spend another night alone in her apartment, drowning in her thoughts. When she arrived, the room was already buzzing with laughter and music. She plastered on a smile, determined to have a good time, but her resolve crumbled the moment she saw them. Daniel and Emily stood near the bar, their bodies angled toward each other in a way that spoke of intimacy. Emily's hand rested casually on his arm, her laughter ringing out like a bell. Amara's stomach churned. She turned to leave, but before she could, someone nudged her. "They look good together, don't they?" the person said, their voice light and conversational. "A power couple." Amara felt the words like a punch to the gut. She mumbled an excuse and fled the room, her vision blurring with tears. Back in her apartment, she collapsed onto her couch, her body racked with sobs. The pain was overwhelming, an all-encompassing ache that left her gasping for air. She cried until there was nothing left, her tears soaking into the cushions. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of her grief, not just for Daniel, but for the version of herself she had lost. The girl who believed in love, who believed she was enough. Amara's chest felt tight as she stumbled out of the party, the sound of laughter and music fading behind her. The cold night air hit her face, but it did little to numb the storm raging inside her. Her hands shook as she fumbled for her phone, trying to call a ride, but her screen blurred through the haze of tears. She couldn't believe she had let herself come here, knowing what she might see. The image of Daniel and Emily together was burned into her mind, replaying over and over like a cruel loop. They looked so perfect, so effortlessly at ease with each other. She hated how much it hurt, how it felt like a confirmation of every insecurity she had tried to bury. Amara's feet carried her down the street, her heels clicking against the pavement. She didn't know where she was going. She just needed to get away, to escape the suffocating weight of her thoughts. When she finally arrived at her apartment, she slammed the door shut behind her, leaning against it as her body shook with sobs. The walls seemed to close in on her, the silence amplifying the sound of her crying. She sank to the floor, her head in her hands. The pain was unbearable, a raw, unrelenting ache that clawed at her chest. It wasn't just about Daniel. It was everything. The whispers, the stares, the feeling of never being enough. "You're so stupid," she whispered to herself, her voice breaking. Why did you think this would end any differently? Her eyes darted to the photos on her bookshelf, pictures of happier times. There they were at the beach, Daniel's arm wrapped around her as they smiled at the camera. There they were at a family barbecue, her mother beaming as she hugged them both. Amara stood abruptly, grabbing the nearest frame and hurling it across the room. It shattered against the wall, the glass scattering like tiny shards of her heart. She paced the apartment, her breathing ragged. Her mind raced with questions she couldn't answer, accusations she couldn't silence. Was it her skin, her hair, her culture? She had tried so hard to fit into Daniel's world, to make herself smaller, quieter, more palatable. She had laughed off the jokes, swallowed the comments, and pretended she didn't notice the way his friends and family looked at her. But it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. The realization hit her like a tidal wave, knocking the air out of her lungs. She fell to her knees, her tears soaking into the carpet. For the first time, she let herself feel the full weight of her loss, not just of Daniel, but of the girl she used to be, the girl who believed in love, who believed she could find a place where she truly belonged. Amara cried until her body had nothing left to give. She sat there in the quiet of her apartment, surrounded by the broken pieces of her past. The silence was heavy, but in it she found a strange sense of clarity. She couldn't keep living like this, trapped in a cycle of pain and self-doubt. Daniel was gone, and no amount of tears or questions would bring him back. Slowly, she stood, brushing the tears from her cheeks. She walked to her desk and opened her laptop, her fingers trembling as she logged into her social media accounts. One by one, she deleted every picture of Daniel. Each click felt like a small act of defiance, a way of reclaiming a part of herself. When she was done, she blocked both Daniel and Emily, cutting off the last ties that bound her to them. It was a small step, but it felt significant. Amara closed her laptop and turned to the mirror, her reflection staring back at her. Her eyes were puffy and red, her curls wild and untamed. For the first time in weeks, she didn't look away. "You're enough," she whispered, her voice shaky but firm. "You've always been enough." The words felt foreign on her tongue, but she repeated them over and over until they began to sink in. The weeks that followed were far from easy. Healing was not a straight path but a jagged one, filled with moments of progress and days of relapse. There were mornings when Amara woke up feeling lighter, her heart no longer weighed down by the memory of Daniel. But there were also nights when the loneliness crept in, whispering doubts that made her question if she would ever truly be whole again. She began to fill her days with small acts of self-care. She joined a yoga class at the community center, finding solace in the quiet rhythm of her breath and the strength of her body as she moved through the poses. She spent more time with her family, letting their love envelop her like a warm embrace. Her mother's laughter, her father's quiet wisdom, it reminded her of the kind of love she wanted in her life, one that was steady, unconditional, and real. Amara also started journaling, pouring her thoughts onto the pages with an honesty she hadn't allowed herself before. She wrote about her pain, her anger, her insecurities, but she also wrote about her dreams, her hopes, and the beauty she was beginning to see in herself again. One day, as she walked past a mirror, she caught a glimpse of her reflection and paused. Her skin glowed in the sunlight streaming through the window, her curls framing her face like a crown. For the first time in what felt like forever, she smiled. Not out of obligation, but because she genuinely felt it. Daniel's rejection had hurt her, left scars that would take time to heal, but it no longer defined her. She was more than his choice, more than society's standards. She was Amara, and she was enough.